Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Shane Bergin, and I work at University College Dublin. And you're very welcome to this, our talk today, Why is Climate Action So Hard, with Professor Philip Kitcher from Columbia University. This is part of an ongoing series brought to you by the UCD Center for Ethics and Public Life and the American University of Armenia. We are delighted to see so many of you joining for the talk today. I'd like to say that we did this on purpose with regards to COP at the moment in Glasgow, but I think it's just been some good coincidence. So we have an excellent speaker and an excellent topic today. As I mentioned, Professor Philip Kitcher from Columbia University will be presenting on his work and perhaps helping us to think about why climate action is so hard. Professor Kitcher is the John Dewey Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Columbia University in New York, and he's a mathematician, a historian, a philosopher by training, and he's regarded as one of the leading figures in the field of philosophy of science today. And he's authored a number of books, and they're all incredibly interesting and well worth a read. In particular, his 2017 book, The Seasons Alter, How to Save Our Planet in 6 Acts, that he co-authored with Evelyn Fox Keller, has been characterized as a landmark work of environmental philosophy that seeks to transform the debate around climate change. And I don't know about you that are here today, but I'm certainly hoping that our world leaders that are in Glasgow at the moment have read Professor Kitcher's book and perhaps may like to listen back to his lecture this afternoon. So as is usual in our lecture series, we will listen to Professor Kitcher's talk, and after Philip's presentation, there will be lots of time for me to put your questions to him. So if you would like to ask a question, you can do so using the chat function, or the questions and answers function rather, at the bottom of your screen. You can pose your questions there, and myself and my colleague, Professor Maria Bagramian from the UCD School of Philosophy, will curate your questions. And as always, we will look for those that are brief and get to the point and crucially have a question mark at the end of them. So we're always flooded with wonderful questions. So please put as many of them as you wish today, and we'll try our best to put them to Philip at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Kitcher and invite him to tell us a little bit more about why climate action is so hard. Professor Kitcher, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Shane, and thank you to Maria and the other organizers for inviting me to be part of this. It is, of course, the question of the moment. What do we do to help future generations cope with what is potentially a much harsher world than we or people who came before us have lived in? So my talk today is an attempt to give a diagnosis of what the problem preventing climate action really is. And it isn't, I think, what you might easily think it is, namely the simple answer. The problem is that there are all these climate deniers out there. People who say, nah, it's not really changing. These are just seasonal fluctuations or annual fluctuations, the sort of thing that has gone on throughout the Earth's history. And even if they are occurring, well, it's no business of ours. We're not responsible for it. Those deniers are much less frequent than they used to be. There are not so many people anymore who are complaining that the science is completely wrong, that the climate scientists' consensus is somehow fabricated, that it's a Chinese hoax or something like that. And what I think is absolutely crucial to realize at the outset is that even if everybody trusted science completely, climate action would still be hard. And I want to try to get to the bottom of that. Issues of trust will arise, but they're not necessarily directed to the places that the simple answer thinks they are. Okay. My tentative diagnosis is that the problem really is not just about the credibility of climate science. It's really because to make decisions about what we should do, and this is what is, of course, occupying the world leaders in Glasgow at the moment, we have to solve a very hard problem. I'll call it the representation problem. And I will bet that in every session in Glasgow, the representation problem will be set up in a faulty way. It will be set up in the way that this was driven home to me during the debates in advance of the last election among the Democratic contenders. One of them, Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, is probably the most outstanding American political leader who has thrown everything into thinking about climate change. And yet Inslee himself, a highly sophisticated man on this topic, put it the wrong way. He put it in terms of, if we do this, we're doomed. If we do that, we can save the world and all will be all right. It's not like that. So let me now characterize the representation problem. Now, everyday decision-making is prudent. Well, if it goes well, it's prudent. And that requires considering the consequences of the available options. If I do this, what will happen? If I do something else, what will happen? And sometimes in conversations like this, people summon up the idea of an ideally rational agent. Whether such an agent exists is, I think, a matter of great it's greatly problematic. This ideally rational agent assigns numerical values, utilities to the outcome, assigns probabilities to the outcomes, and then chooses a course of action whose expected utility is at least as great as that of any rival option. Now, that can be done on certain occasions. Those occasions are, I think, quite rare. So how do you do when you can't do that kind of thing, when you can't specify the values, when you can't specify the probabilities? Well, you act as other agents do when they rightly recognize that that's impossible. They consider outcomes. Nonetheless, how do they do it? Well, I'm going to take one of my favorite figures from the history of science, although not when he was actually doing science. Charles Darwin married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and when he was deciding whether he should propose to her, he divided a sheet of paper into two columns. And you can see the kinds of things that he considered. Marrying would give him a constant companion, a friend in old age, and I have to say, rather problematically, better than a dog anyhow. On the other hand, if he didn't marry, there would be no quarrels at home. He could go off to scientific societies and enjoy learned conversation all the time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Darwin, having put those things out there, made his decision. He scribbles across the bottom of the page, marry, marry, marry. So he obviously felt pushed in a particular direction, even though he couldn't assign values, he couldn't assign probabilities or anything like that. And that's the way we often act. We line up the consequences of particular options for us, and then we feel moved in a particular direction. And that's probably the best we can do. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, which I think is the story that underlies the representation problem. So it's something that comes closer to home. So imagine you and some other people have visited apparently friendly hosts. And after a while, they began to act strangely. They're no longer as hospitable as they once were. And one day, they lock you all up and tell you that you have to play a version of Russian roulette. You plead for time. So here you are, you're off in this with these apparently friendly people who suddenly tell you that you're going to have to play a version of Russian roulette. And you all plead for time. You say, no, 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 please don't do this to us. And they say, fine. We're going to give you some rules, and then the outcome, this outcome with which we've sort of confronted you, will be held in the future. And depending on what you do, the game will either be worse or better, the game of Russian roulette. So the gun you're going to use has a very large number of chambers. You will, in the future, draw a card to determine the part of your body to which it will be applied. Your host will then spin the chambers on the gun. You will pull the trigger. And that's that. They grant you a delay. You don't have to do it right now. And they say, the chambers of the gun will be loaded, and the cards from which you have to draw will be determined by your obedience in the interim to a set of rules. If you conform to the rules very well, then more of the cards will be benign and more of the bullets will be duds. Good. But obeying the rules is extremely costly. It imposes severe burdens on you. So what should you do? Some of the cards will say things like, point the gun at your temple or your chest or your big toe. Not too bad, that. Or shoot out the window. Really good, that. Or your little finger or your neck. Other parts of the body too. Okay, and the number of bullets, or the proportion of the bullets in the chambers, and the number of ones that aren't going to do you any great harm, just going to be rubber, will also be determined by how good you are at following the rules. Okay, it's a silly story, but let's refine it a little. The conditions imposed on different groups of your party are different. Some are going to be much more burdened by the rules than others. And probability estimates are available here and there for a few, but only a few courses of action. Climate decisions are like that, because we need to know lots of things which we don't know. Something about the distribution of the cards, what kinds of threats will arise and where they will do so. Something about the distribution of the bullets, how severe they will be and how our attempts to adapt will cope with them. And something about the likely burdens of conforming to the rules. We know none of these things, at least none of them in any great detail at all. The representation problem is, how do we represent all of these unknown aspects of the situation? How can we make a sensible decision about what to do? We need to identify outcomes whose chances have to be taken seriously, and we have to recognize the burdens of conformity. All right, so that's the problem. It's thoroughly probabilistic, and we don't know the probabilities. And we can't even assess all the options. So let's take a first step and think about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its wonderful reports. They're the best things we have. They're very helpful. They assemble scientific information of all kinds, but they're limited. They tend to focus on constant average effects like sea level rise. There's little, but increasingly now some emphasis on episodic threats. Not where's the sea level are going to rise to on average, but where's the sea level going to go in a really severe storm, and how often are such storms likely? And third, at an even greater level of complexity, attention needs to be given to interactions among those threats, what I'll call cascades. Cases in which one particular threat arises with enormous urgency and forces people to leave a place. They can't get food. They are carrying diseases. They have to enter territory that doesn't belong to them, in which people are already struggling. And so that may give rise to all sorts of political and social hostilities and difficulties, and it may give rise to the eruption of new diseases and new disease vectors. That's the sort of thing I want you to think about as a cascade. It's not a single event. It's something that is a chain of events which demand all sorts of different responses, and typically quickly. Okay. This sort of analysis is given in a very good book by David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth, in which he tries to assess some of the ways in which episodic effects will occur and how they might interact with one another. He recognizes the importance of these things I've called cascades, but Wallace Wells cannot provide any overall picture of the likely consequences of any policy adoption. What on earth are we to do in this kind of situation? So what we need really is some policy proposals. Here are some emissions targets. They will presumably determine the course of future mean temperatures, but we don't really know how. And those future mean temperatures, as well as the degree of acidification of the oceans, et cetera, will determine a range of likely cascades, but we don't know that relationship either. And that will determine a range of likely human futures. This, as you can see, is really hard. Uncertainties are all over the place. In connecting emissions trajectories with future temperatures, this is a matter that climate scientists struggle with and try to work out. In estimating how various parts of the globe will be affected, here I think we know enough to say that all parts of the globe will be affected, at least on a gross scale. No continent is going to get off scot-free. Interestingly, Europe, where climate action is probably more advanced than anywhere else, is probably the least likely continent to suffer. In deciding when cascades of particular kinds are likely, how likely is it that migration will be forced on enormous scales, and how likely is it that that will lead to the emergence of new diseases or the spreading of old diseases? And in understanding the economic impacts of all of this, will it be possible to sustain economic life in the face of these kinds of cascades? And finally, in the effects on human welfare. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to concentrate on humans. It does seem to me that it's ethically important to deal with the interests of non-human animals, at least some of them. But that's an enormously difficult problem. I'll be prepared to talk about that a little bit in the question and answer period if people would like me to. Okay, so climate scientists cannot provide us with fine-grained models or predictions for particular reasons. And the final question, what will happen to human beings, and questions about their future economic activity and abilities to sustain themselves, won't just involve the physical variables. They will involve the effects of many future human decisions about which we can know nothing at the moment. And those decisions will be affected by all kinds of things we can't know. And that means an enormous set of causal factors is potentially relevant. You might, at this point, throw up your hands in despair and say, what on earth can we do? That's why it seems to me the Russian roulette story, silly though it may be, is very useful, because we can imagine ourselves in that kind of situation. And we can try to think about the ways we might behave. I'll come to that a bit later. So the representation problem doesn't admit any exact solution, and it's impossible to say with any serious precision what particular policy options will likely deliver, or what burdens pursuing them will impose, or how those burdens will be distributed. Okay, so I hope that convinces you that of the simplicity, the false simplicity of Inslee's famous, Inslee is very good. I mean, he's a very enlightened man on this issue. On his remark that, if we act now, we can be saved. If we don't act, we're doomed. It's not like that. And people know it's not like that. So we are faced with a situation in which we have to decide under radical uncertainty. Not just that cost-benefit fails us, as it often does, even the kinds of qualitative decision-making in which Darwin engaged can't work here. So what's to be done? Well, here's an inspiration from the history of science. When you've got a problem that's too complex to solve in its original form, try to idealize it. Try to get rid of some of the complicating factors and see if you can reduce it to a problem you can solve. Galileo famously did that brilliantly. Will that strategy work in this case? Well, let's try it and see. So, the Inslee line, too simplifying, it's a dangerous idealization. Why is it a dangerous idealization? To say that unless we act now, it will be too late, invites the question, too late for what? This situation is inherently probabilistic. It's not clear that there is a future that is completely benign. Many climate scientists would say we've already gone too long without doing anything. So there's very little chance, if any, that our descendants can enjoy the kind of environment that humans have enjoyed, say, for the last century or so. But we can talk about something concrete. So let's try to do that. Let's try to focus on what I'll call the sort of existential threat of premature human extinction. One day, it'll happen eventually, our species will go extinct. And you might say, well, here's one goal. Let's avoid going extinct too far before we would have had to go extinct anyway. Let's try to avoid premature human extinction. So we might try to ask this question. What should we do that would avoid having significant probability to premature human extinction, say within 4 or 5 centuries, to stop our species from just being wiped out within 400 or 500 years? Well, we might say that limiting emissions of greenhouse gases in a fairly decisive and radical way would make the chance of premature human extinction negligible. So that's what drives, of course, the worldwide movement taken up by so many people, including many, many young people, to force nations to adopt targets and stick to them for emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But that is typically met by another counter-argument. It involves a familiar kind of being, a deus ex machina. Climate activists are wrong, say the proponents of this strategy. There are already available means of avoiding the existential threat, because if all else fails, we can engage in geoengineering. And there are 2 kinds of geoengineering. One is what I'll call the negative kind, in which we take stuff out of the atmosphere. We try to not only to do carbon capture and storage on factories that are emitting these kinds of gases, but also to go beyond that to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And then on the other hand, there's positive geoengineering. Unfortunately, the negative kind is the good kind, and positive geoengineering is the bad kind, which is to add to the atmosphere to counteract the greenhouse effect. Now, negative geoengineering returns us to a state we've already experienced. We know we can live with that. Positive geoengineering launches us into uncharted territory. Firing stuff up into the sky might do something to reflect back some of the incoming solar radiation. But we have no idea what it would be like to live in a world with an atmosphere like that. So the great hope is really negative geoengineering. Some people look at this in terms of planting lots of trees, but a few quick calculations will reveal that the rate at which trees sort of absorb some of the carbon from the atmosphere is unfortunately too low, and the lifespan of the trees when they can do that is too short, so that even if we planted trees everywhere, it wouldn't work. It would not be enough. But there are places around the world, the picture on the right shows one in Switzerland, where some carbon sucking from the atmosphere can be done on a small scale. I have to say that when I learned about this in a New York Times article, I was utterly appalled by the coverage of it. This is, after all, a great hope. And all the article could find to talk about was how, under a capitalist economy, you might get funding for research of this kind. One would have thought governments all over the world would be clamoring to try to support these kinds of ventures. Okay, a little rant, I'm sorry. So let's try thinking like a Koch. So here are the Koch brothers. Only one of them, I think, is now still alive. And for years, they have, of course, funded and fueled the anti-climate activism movement. Let's try to understand what kinds of considerations, not the kinds of considerations that move them, those are rather obvious, but what kinds of considerations they appeal to in presenting the case for continuing business as usual to willing and, I would say, credulous listeners. So let's have a look. There's a museum in Washington, D.C., which has been set up by the Kochs, and it doesn't say this, but it's clear what the subtext is. Human beings are remarkably good at adaptation. We're so resourceful, we can do so many things, we can live in harsh environments. So it's a picture of human history going way back into our prehistory that celebrates the idea of human beings adapting to the world and coming increasingly to control it. So we'll find ways to remove greenhouse gases before it's too late. Don't worry about it. Technology will provide. That's a powerful reason. So suppose you're in the roulette situation and somebody comes in and says, look, there are lots of people out there who know where we are, and they'll find ways of getting to us and rescuing us. That's the analog of thinking like a Koch. Would you be, as it were, soothed and uplifted by that to think, well, they'll probably come get us before it's too late. They'll rescue us. I wouldn't. So the Koch line, activism is alarmism. Policies called for by climate change activists are bound to disrupt human lives. They're bound to disrupt economic growth. So they're going to reduce human welfare and possibly even interfere with the technological miracle that will save us. So climate alarmism is to be resisted. Now, this argument is, I think, profoundly wrong, but it's not hard to see how eminently saleable it is, how eminently plausible it can come to seem. So the argument trades, I think, on neglecting flaws in the idealization. The ignorance, our current ignorance about all of these things shouldn't masquerade as knowledge. It shouldn't, as it were, give us inspiration to think, oh, there's a problem here, but technology can surely solve it. After all, we don't know lots of things. We don't even know if sucking carbon out of the atmosphere on a large scale is possible, if it will come in time, how climate shocks will affect human welfare or economic growth, or even the development of technology. I mean, the Kochians are very, very worried that if we do various kinds of active things to help with the climate, then the world economies are going to suffer. But they never think about how the world economies are going to suffer under the impacts of episodic effects and cascades of such effects. We don't know the probabilities here, so it's impossible to say how to balance those. We just know that there are dangers in both places, and not, as the Kochians pretend, just in one place. But Kochianism obviously appeals because, and now I'm coming really to the heart of the matter, many people around the world today are already struggling. It isn't unreasonable for them to think that if the activists get their way, their own difficulties will be intensified. If you're in a precarious position in society and hanging on to a job just and working very hard and trying to provide for your children, then the idea of a sudden change in the rules of the game as you've experienced them may thrust you into complete destitution and penury. They may blight the future of those you care most about. And so people say it would be better to resist these destabilizing changes and to hope that we get a technological solution. But that's risky because it puts all its eggs in one basket and it fails to appreciate the climate impacts that will already occur before we get the technological solution, assuming that we do get such a solution. And it tolerates massive suffering that those impacts will bring and that we've already started to see in wildfires and heat waves and floods and droughts and hurricane damage and all the rest of it. So, consider two possible futures. Serious attempts are made to limit emissions. They do cause economic disruption, massive unemployment, significant increases in poverty and its consequences. But eventually, technology delivers a solution. Another, business as usual is combined with serious investment in negative geoengineering. Climate shocks increase in frequency and severity, but technology solves the problem. That, I think, is the way in which this kind of let's not be too active appeals to people. There are just these two kinds of futures. And notice, if we engaged in the first future, we'd probably regret it later on when technology delivers the solution. But it's not clear how to compare the two scenarios in the first place. But much more importantly, these scenarios fail utterly to represent the full range of potential futures. They don't, for example, allow for those in which technology doesn't deliver or comes too late, even to save us from premature extinction, let alone massive human suffering. So I just ask you, are you like me or are you a sort of quasi-Kochian? Would you bet everything on the arrival of rescuers? So it seems to me we need a different kind of idealization. And it's got to attend to a number of features that my stories so far have started to bring out. The first thing it's got to attend to is the plight of the poor today, the vulnerable people today, and to their vulnerability in the face of climate change. It's a point often made, but it deserves repeating, that those who are most likely to be at risk of severe damage in the future are those who are suffering most today. It's quite likely, perhaps, that within 70 or even 50 years, a large proportion of the world's human population will be displaced, no longer able to live in the places where the people have been living. That will be an immigration and migration crisis that will make what we have seen so far seem child's play. So, and we need a solution somehow that avoids staking the human future on an unknown technological fix. So the idealization has to honor the probabilistic character of our predicament and our ignorance. It must qualitatively present the major threats and the burdens of mitigating them. And it must recognize the differences in the situations of different groups. This is very important. If climate action is to have a chance of persuading a majority of nations, then it really has to come to terms with the fact that the burdens of climate activism fall differently on different nations and on different segments of society. So I'll make a proposal. The idealization of the representation problem we seek must, I think, be collective. In this respect, the COP meetings are right. It has to respond to the needs and hopes of different groups within the human population. It has to get everybody together in coordinated action. And it must apportion burdens in ways that can be recognized as just. It's this last step that is, of course, so profoundly difficult. So how do you do that? I think you have to do it through fully representative deliberation. Deliberation that undercuts asymmetries in power, not through existing structures of power or through ignoring the interests of different groups, or through avoiding issues of moral accountability. Certain nations, including my own, most obviously my own, do avoid those issues with great regularity. They do not recognize the fact that they have already emitted far more than their share of carbon and other greenhouse gases, into carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Indeed, the United States has already taken up more of its fair share in what we might think of as a reservoir in the sky. It's taken up more of its fair share since James Hansen's famous report to the US Senate. So that is an extreme lapse in moral accountability. So I'm going to suggest this has to start with a kind of grassroots deliberative democracy that brings people together. So I'm going to suggest three conditions on democratic deliberation. First, you've got to include all perspectives in your society. And that means the poor and vulnerable, as well as the rich and powerful. And these people have to be well informed. Deliberators have to be able to use the best available information. And most importantly of all, they have to be mutually engaged. And this is the condition which I think is hardest to meet. They must be committed to seeking a solution all can tolerate, one that all can see as fair, even if it goes against many of their own interests. Can you do that? Well, there have been promising experiments along these lines of deliberative democracy. So, as James Fishkin and Bruce Ackerman have argued, and indeed shown through staging deliberative democracy, people can modify their initial opinions. The most successful ventures bring together, first, relatively small numbers of open-minded people, and that has been done by Emmanuel Macron, in particular, in France. So this is a plug for Monsieur Macron. Perhaps what we need is a climate version of Le Grand Débat, the citizens' climate councils all over the place. Around the world, on one day every month, let's say, people come together in small groups to work through the representation problem as best they can. That means, as it were, pooling everybody's perspectives, trying to see where the vulnerabilities arise and to respond to them. And they're advised by experts on the empirical issues that arise for them. And if they can't agree on who the experts are, then they have to engage in inquiry together to figure out who's worth trusting and who isn't. And it snowballs as groups reach consensus and what policies seem most acceptable. They exchange representatives with neighboring groups. And so you try to get consensus across the small groups, make them bigger groups and bigger groups and bigger groups and bigger groups. And with luck, the mix becomes ever more diverse and consensus grows and governments must respond to grassroots pressure. Well, that can't just happen once. It must be ongoing in the way that COP meetings are ongoing, although they're far too infrequent. It can't be a one-shot affair because our policies will need to adapt as we learn more, as people come to know more about threats and the possibilities of avoiding, mitigating, or adapting to them. Because there are sometimes possibilities of adapting, and there are avoidance strategies. As everything becomes clearer, you move in the direction that seems most promising. As you would do if you were lost in a dark and dangerous wood and had to get out before darkness descends. Maybe there are nasty animals around. You'd move in the most promising direction and you'd try to pool whatever information you could to coordinate your activities. And you'd adjust your strategy as you go. Now, if that doesn't happen, if we can't make that work, it's not clear to me how we solve the problem. So, moved by the consideration of the planet we see on the left, and to try to avoid the chances that will become the way we see on the right, I think the best option for us is to come together, to try to fashion whatever kinds of solidarity we can, to try to respond to the vulnerabilities that currently prevent decisive climate action, and work together as best we can. I just hope we have time for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was a really wonderful and insightful presentation, and we have lots of questions in from the many people who have been watching. And if anyone has another question, feel free to use the questions and answers button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll put it to Professor Kitcher in a moment. Professor Kitcher, I might begin by asking, are you familiar with the Irish Citizens Assembly model that has been around here now for quite some time? And you're nodding, yes. So I'm involved in one myself on an issue of education, and when talking with those in government, they often tell us it's best to stick to something that's rather binary. You know, should we have or not have marriage equality, or should we have abortion rights for women, etc. So it's kind of yes or no, things that can be ultimately put to a populace through a referendum. It strikes me what you're talking about is a far broader issue where there are many possible outcomes, and perhaps there's a degree of thinking that's required. What would you say to those in power that say, no, the public can only handle simple yes or no scenarios? What you're talking about is just too hard.
Okay, so look, I'm so glad you actually brought up the Irish Assembly, because if somebody had opened the question by saying, this never works, I would have pointed to two terrific examples. One is in British Columbia, where a citizens group in the early part of this century, I think it was around 2006, developed a proposal for a new constitution together. Notice that isn't binary. And then, of course, the Irish, and especially the Irish question about abortion. I mean, that seems to me an incredibly successful piece of deliberative democracy. Fishkin has got lots of cases which are more or less successful, and some of them are binary and others are not. But you can't actually tackle a problem by pretending that it can be made binary. And this is one which you can't do, it seems to me. So, look, I think you try to move people by giving them something like the roulette story as an analogy, and then say, okay, now how can we relate these various kinds of proposals that we might have? Should we all get on board with actually following the rules exactly? Well, if we do that, and we're concerned to respond to the needs of some of the people who are around us, who are in this business with us, then what we have to do is give them certain kinds of protections. So I think, in fact, the truly obvious thing to say about the kind of proposal that I make is that a necessary condition of finding any kind of solution is a social framework within each country that enables the vulnerable to be protected. Look, I think if the advocates for sticking with coal come what may in the US or in other countries were told and believed and trusted the answer, that's important, that they would be taken care of, that they would not become unemployed, that serious job retraining programs would be given for them, that there would be a minimum basic income for them, that their health and their children's health would be protected, that something would be done for the education of their children. I mean, all of the kinds of things that go on in the most egalitarian societies of the world would be put in place. Then, it seems to me, you blunt some of this opposition to climate activism.
It's interesting you mentioned that, as the national debate here at the moment is around methane, given the size of our agriculture sector. Yeah. And there's been articles in some of our newspapers saying that, you know, farmers need some assurance, and they wouldn't be associated in Ireland as farming wouldn't be associated with big money. So I feel like, you know, perhaps some of the points you're making there would be very, very helpful in our national discourse in that area. I have another question for you, and this one is from Heather Douglas, who's one of the previous speakers from this series.
Yes.
Thank you, Heather. It sounds like you know her. Heather says, something seems to be missing from the decision model. There are not just costs of conformity, there are also substantial benefits. And she gives the examples of electric cars are quieter, induction stoves are safer, renewable energy reduces air pollution. And it is now the cheapest form of new energy. Does clarifying those benefits change the model, she asks?
It helps. I think, I mean, the last one I think is probably the most important one of all. It helps to do that, but it doesn't really address the situation of the vulnerable. So look, Heather, I'm going to put this to you as a four-sided dilemma. Well, if that's an awful oxymoron, I'll call it a quadrilemma if I must. The first desideratum is do something to protect future generations. The second is respond to the needs of the poor in affluent societies. The third is respond to the legitimate interests and yearnings that exist in the poorer nations of the world for electrification. How are these nations going to enjoy the benefits of the technologies that have been generated in the affluent world through the use in the past of far too many fossil fuels, and that continues to happen. So this is where what I was talking about earlier about the moral accountability of the rich nations must come in. They are not only the ones who have created the mess, they're also the ones with the ability actually to pay. So there must be a general acknowledgement that climate help to the developing nations isn't some sort of nice thing to do, some act of super irrigation or something like that. It's an absolute moral imperative. These nations should not be deprived by the greed and the indifference of the affluent world that has, so fecklessly filled up our atmosphere with the greenhouse gases and now refuses to do its bit for the rest. And the fourth part of the dilemma is, while we're doing all of these things, we have to try to preserve all sorts of important things that have emerged from the human past. Many people would point to cultural artifacts. Many people would also point to features of society, to constitutions, to bits and pieces of social machinery that must not be eroded. So that's what makes things so difficult. So I would actually, to go back to your binary point, if I were structuring the conversation, I would say, look, we've got these four kinds of things that we want to do. We've got limited resources for doing it. We've got to find a balance between the needs of future generations, the poor and vulnerable in the affluent world, all of the nations that want the serious technology that's been developed in the affluent world, and preserving the great heritage of the past. And doing that is going to be hard, and it's going to be imperfect. But you can see the way I'm trying to structure these kinds of debates by thinking in terms of small groups of people coming to terms with that particular problem. And of course, it's framed by the large-scale risks of all sorts of bad things happening, and our ignorance about what the extent of those risks is, and about the frequency with which they'll occur. That's why the gun and the cards come into the game. So I hope that answers your question, Heather. It's good to hear from you.
Heather, feel free to reply if you wish in the questions and answers. It is lovely to hear from you. We have another pointing question from Berthold Kuhn, who says, in the end, it looks like a good but suggests naive proposal, unrealistic to implement in most parts of the world. The question also arises whether the poor could afford long-term perspectives and agree to short-term sacrifices, and whether uneducated people would have the vision to share your deliberations and make rational contributions to the process. Incidentally, that's not been the case here in Ireland during citizens' assemblies. I'm also worried about the potential trade-offs between grassroots democracy and fast climate action, and have no solution for it. Thank you anyway, though, and looking forward to hearing your comments.
Okay.
So that's from Berthold.
So let's start with the last point. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that worry. I mean, is this just too slow a mechanism? It may be, but we're not going to get very far without it. I mean, there's a certain kind of solidarity that I think has to be developed. Otherwise, we'll have Greta Thunberg and all of the young, for whom I have to say climate action is easier. First of all, they're going to be the ones who suffer if we don't engage in it. And second, they haven't yet made the investment of their lives in particular directions. They haven't, as it were, got a particular place in the society and in the economy, which, if it's knocked away from them, will leave them completely, destitute. So they are going to be opposed by people who feel that these actions make them even more vulnerable than they now are. And that's going to go nowhere until you get some kind of solidarity happening. And I think, the experimental evidence on this is pretty good, that if you actually do engage in these face-to-face discussions, there can be a new concept of co-citizenship. And it can be the case people start trying to compromise with one another and trying to distribute resources in ways that respond to every constituency. So I would say that to start off with. The worry about human, uneducated people. I mean, of course, it depends on how uneducated, but a very large proportion of the citizens of I think any country I have been to would be able to participate in these debates. There may be countries in which that's not the case. I mean, after all, we don't believe anymore with Plato that the populace is just too unintelligent to engage in democracy. We tend to think that the populace can be misinformed, it can be ignorant, but those are remediable things. If we're talking about the capacity to learn and the capacity to think through issues in these kinds of situations, it ought to be able to foster that. And that's the kind of thing the deliberative democracy experiments have shown. Now, the final point, which was actually the first question, I would say it's a genuine worry. I mean, do some countries actually have the social structures to set this up? If they don't, then again, there's a moral obligation on the part of the richer countries to help them to do so. I mean, if I may say something about the way in which I think attempts to engage in collective decision-making currently fail, I think it happens like this. So each nation says, okay, there's going to be a period in which we do something, and then at the other end, we have created some sort of sustainable environment that isn't too bad. The trouble is that they then think, well, how do we get ourselves into the best position we could possibly be to compete when we come out of the period of transition? How do we find ourselves equipped with the comparative advantages that we've long enjoyed when we come out at the other end? And that then creates a jockeying for positions that is completely undermines the ability to negotiate. So without a conception of pan-human solidarity, eventually, this isn't going to work. And you don't get pan-human solidarity by keeping people at a distance from one another. The way to foster it seems to me, and this seems to me clear from the deliberative democracy and literature and the experiments that have been done, is to bring people of opposing views together face to face. Sure as hell, it doesn't work on the internet where you're not face to face, but that seems to me, and this brings me back again to the final point that this speaker, that this astute questioner made. We may not be able to break down all polarizations and all oppositions, but unless we do break it down, at least to some sizable degree, then this won't work. Negotiations will always break down. Climate action will always be too slow and too little. So I don't claim that this will lead us out into the sunshine again, tolerable sunshine, let's say. But I think it's really the best we can do.
So thank you for your very comprehensive answer there. It was very engaging. It neatly leads to a question from Catherine Collins, who asks of your views on the proposed 2050 zero emissions target. What are your views about it? Like, I suppose that the headline outcomes from the likes of COP tend to be X% cut in Y. By a certain date, and it's numeric as a target that we have deliverables now, and we have to go away and work toward them. I've not heard from political leaders messaging that's similar to what you're saying. I've heard it from other leaders like Mary Robinson and David Attenborough and others, and Greta Thunberg, indeed, where they're saying it's more important for us to do and to talk meaningfully. But what are your thoughts on the headlines being numbers rather than process?
I'm terribly pessimistic about it. I mean, slide after slide. I mean, I didn't show them today, but graph after graph after graph shows that the numbers agreed on are too low, and that the performance after the agreement just breaks down completely. So the agreement at Paris has made perhaps some difference, and we are now, it's better off than continuing the old trajectory, but not much better off than continuing the old trajectory. I think until you get over the internal opposition within nations, especially the big emitting nations, you're not going to get good performance, even on minimal targets. And because the politicians who are negotiating these targets know that there's a lot of opposition to them, the targets are set very low in the first place. So I'm very sad about this. I mean, I think Paris was a moment of hope. I think it was almost complete consensus on the part of people who write responsibly about climate change that too little was being asked for. But there was optimism that people would get close to the targets. The record is very sad on that. And I think it's now clearer than ever that much more urgent action is needed. I doubt very much that it will come out of Glasgow. I'm sad to say that. I mean, the question, the nice way you put that question, and I think perhaps the way the question put the question is, process is absolutely crucial. This is not about just saying, well, let's get there. You've got to know roughly how you're going to get there for this to be meaningful.
Pete Lunn, a colleague from the Economic, Social and Research Institute, has a question about free riders and says the collective action literature shows that the punishment of free riders is vital when trying to solve such problems. How do we deal with non-cooperating states, therefore?
So it depends where the non-cooperation goes, actually. I mean, suppose that they don't agree to set up a deliberative model at all. That goes nowhere. The answer is you try to get to the bottom of why they aren't doing that and try to overcome whatever difficulties they see in doing that. If they engage in deliberation and then at the end of the day, don't live up to the promises they've made or make inadequate promises, then the incentive structure has to be changed. And the rest of the world, I mean, presumably, if we think of free riders, we tend to think of free riders as being a minority. The rest of the world has to bribe or bully the free riders into cooperating. And that can be done in all sorts of ways. But it does, I mean, the astute point, I think, behind the question is that you've got to have some serious sort of collective action on the part of those who are not free riding. Otherwise, of course, the incentive structure of the situation will lead to ever more free riding, and the whole thing will collapse.
Yeah, indeed. There's a comment here from another previous speaker, Professor Maya Goldenberg from Guelph in Ontario, Canada, who says, I think there is more resistance to the belief that the publics can effectively deliberate than Professor Kitcher allows. Numerous political philosophers writing about the failures of democracy due to irrational publics, for example, Brennan Against Democracy, and Alex Guerrero in favor of a new word for me, lottocracy. So would you like to respond to Maya's point?
Yeah, so there are lots of people who are skeptical about this. It's possible that I see the glass as half full. None of these experiments are perfect. But as the British Columbia example shows, as the Irish example goes, as some of Fishkin's examples show, as some of the discussions in France have shown, you can get somewhere. We shouldn't let the idea that, sometimes things go wrong and sometimes it doesn't work prevent us from appreciating the fact that we can make progress along these lines. This goes back again to a previous question that's been asked. Is it going to be so difficult to get these kinds of deliberations going in a successful way that it will be too slow? That seems to me a serious and an open question. And what one can try to do is to make the processes as informed as possible and as smooth as possible in light of the experiments that have been done. I mean, lots of things are not known about how to set up this kind of deliberation. For example, should you have a moderator or shouldn't you? Should you have two moderators? Should there be very explicit rules for how the discussion is to be structured? How do you select the people who do it? I'm inclined to think that what you're looking for is representatives of every perspective, but people who, on some social psychological scale can be appraised as willing to listen to others and willing to think about changing their minds. So you don't want the table thumpers and the conversation stoppers to dominate. So there are all of these things, and discussions will go better if some of the, as it were, the nitty-gritty details of the process are worked out. And the good news is that deliberative Democrats, and I've mentioned some of them, Hélène Landemort is another person, are actually working very seriously on these problems of how you get effective deliberation to work. So, you obviously do not want to have people who are completely incapable of thinking through an issue. I guess I'm more optimistic in thinking that most people are like that, and that most people and also in thinking that you can choose people who are sufficiently undogmatic to represent a position.
Yeah, indeed. And I know from rather distant engagement with the distant, as in I wasn't involved directly in the Citizens Assembly here around our changes to abortion law, but tasteful, or rather appropriate inclusion of people with lived experience and a range of experts really brought the conversation away from those polarized dogmatic positions to a more common space. Myself, I've been involved in preparation for a Citizens Assembly here on the purpose of education in our society, and in the original conversations about that, it was the voice of young people that transformed those conversations, as it really grounded it in reality. I'm mindful of perhaps our last question here, based on something that Ritwik Cherian has said. What can we do, perhaps, after hearing your talk today? And there's a lot of conversation about the balance between individual responsibilities and responsibilities of leaders, be they political or otherwise. But what can somebody listening to this conversation today do or think afterward? How can we find it some hope here and maybe begin the types of conversations that you're talking about? Where do we start?
It's very good question. I mean, I'm always worried that when you start asking the question of what I can do, what can I do, it may provoke the acceptance of the idea that if enough individuals started recycling and not using certain kinds of things and not eating certain kinds of things, et cetera, and not driving certain kinds of cars, everything would be all right. This is an issue on which I'm very pessimistic. I think it's got to be done systematically. There are certain things that countries have to do, because in a large industrial or post-industrial economy, you've got all of this machinery that's set up in a particular way. Unless you change that, then the contributions of individuals are going to be very small. But what can an individual do? Well, if you're an individual who can actually join a climate discussion group, I would urge doing that. And I would urge trying to set up such groups. And I would urge trying to talk with voters who might otherwise select candidates who resist, climate issues. Just simply working at local levels and trying to increase awareness of what I take to be the structure of the problem. In a certain sense, most of my lecture was about diagnosis and not about really prospects for treatment or cures. And the questions have mostly focused on the prospects for treatment and cures. But part of the problem is that this kind of diagnosis, I think, has not been accepted. The problem is diagnosed in different ways by different groups. And Kochianism is very plausible to some groups of people. What I would like to see is a general acceptance of what this problem really deeply is, and an acceptance of the idea that it inevitably must involve a kind of solidarity, a new kind of citizenship, and a new kind of concern. And I think dividing up the four constituencies, as I've done, future generations, those who are vulnerable in the affluent world, the developing nations or the nations that yearn for development, and those who are dead, and dedication to preserving the heritage of the past. Those are all important things, and they've all got to be brought together. And people have got to work out together how to balance what we do so that we can get climate action done to prevent the world from becoming harsher than it needs to be. Maybe certain kinds of sacrifices may have to be demanded of future generations, but we should do the best we can to minimize those given the other constraints.
Yes, perhaps so. And one would hope that, after a certain activation energy, that the positive effects will start to come, and there will be a sense of collective pride and capacity that, we will see we are doing well by working that way. So we'll end on a message of hope. Professor Kitcher, thank you again.
I like that message of hope, I have to say.
Yeah, I think we all need it. Because I don't know about you, but I heard somebody who hosts one of our national radio programs this morning saying the news is very hard at the moment. You'd sit there with kind of dull terror. Is COVID ever going to go away? Will we ever get to the bottom of climate issues? We sort of yearn for the rather more simplistic economic crises of the past, and these rather socio-scientific existential crises that we're looking at the moment are daunting. But I suppose as a scientist, I have to hope in the process, in the capacity. I wouldn't be of the of the inclination that things will just come and rescue us, because I think maybe working in science, I realize that doesn't happen. So but I think we can be hopeful, and I want to thank you for doing such a good job today at helping us to diagnose what's going on and to understand perhaps why climate action is so hard. If it weren't, wouldn't it be awful that we hadn't solved it already? Yes. So the fact that it is hard in some way gives us somewhat, maybe a little bit of a pass to say, yes, it has been hard, but that the positive futures are there for the taking. So I thank you again, and thank everyone who tuned in to the conversation today. I've good news for you in that our previously cancelled lecture with Asa Wickfors from Stockholm University has been rescheduled for the 9th of November. I won't be joining you as I'm getting married this weekend, and so I'll be on honeymoon on the 9th of November, but my colleague Maria Bagramian will host the session that day, and Asa will be speaking to you on what is knowledge resistance, a very, very interesting topic. So it just leaves me to thank Professor Philip Kitcher once more, and to thank you for your time and participation today. Take care, and bye-bye.